In this chapter, I would like to introduce you to the big modular, and we want to create a patch from scratch. I pulled all the cables, which means we are going to go step by step through the process, and we'll end up with a techno baseline that we can use as the foundation for a track. First of all, I want to say that just because the modular is big, it doesn't mean you have to use all the bits and pieces all the time. This is one of the most important lessons that I personally learned in the process of working with synthesizers in general, but also with modular synthesizers for many years. That it's nice to have options, but sometimes one oscillator is doing the trick, and this of course doesn't really make a difference whether you do this with analog hardware or inside the box. One oscillator is one oscillator, and I think it's always a good idea to use as much as you want and as much as you need, but as little as you can get away with, because sounds that get too complex all by themselves might sound good, but when you put them in a full arrangement, they might not even translate that well anymore. It might just blur the overall sound picture because they are just far too complex as a team player. And so, having said that, I sometimes get the impression that the modular can be intimidating to people because it's big, it's huge, it's a big wall of black modules and cables and stuff. But it's always important for me to note that if you basically look at what it does, it's fairly simple technology, because this is a original Moog System 35, which is one of the reissue anniversary models, which has been made a couple of years ago, but it has been made exactly the same way, from the same parts and everything, like the original series in the early 70s was made. And that means, of course, that our synthesizer world has developed a lot in the decades that were to follow, and I always used to say that this is kind of like modular synthesizer grammar school in a way, because you don't have all the fancy stuff and all the bells and whistles that you find everywhere with Eurorack these days, and which are of course beautiful, but this is very basic. And in general, I think it's a good idea to think of it as a mini Moog with more options. Conceptually, I think it's a good way to look at it like this, because, like I said, it's modular grammar school in the way that we have oscillators, we have noise, we have another oscillator that we can use as an LFO, we have the infamous fixed filter bank, we have a high pass and a low pass filter, VCAs, envelopes, and the bottom row is basically just mixers and control voltage, routing options and attenuators for control voltages. So if you break it down, it's not actually that difficult. And for this patch that we are generating now, it's kind of like my basic patch that could be a starting point for many different things, and it will consist of not much more than two oscillators, a noise source that we can optionally add into the sound picture, and I just have to connect the cables. There's an individual output for every waveform, so I'm going for the sawtooth right now. This is the noise coming out, with a little high pass and low pass filter, which is not voltage controlled, which is very practical, because this way you can shape the raw super wide sound of the noise to something that's a little less boomy, little less bass frequencies before you even put it into the mixer and into the filters with the other oscillators. Because if you use the raw unfiltered noise, it has a lot of bass frequencies which tend to muddy up the sound, and this way you can just add a little bit of sharp sparkle on the top of the normal oscillators without all the unwanted boomy parts of the noise. So now we have our sound sources going into the mixer. We take the mixer output, we go to our filters. First of all, the high pass. From the high pass to the low pass. And now the output from the low pass we would typically put into a VCA, and then we go straight to the output. But in this case, just because, and I can do it, and this is one of the nice things when you work with a modular synthesizer. Most synthesizers just have a single VCA at the output, and they are, of course, having a monophonic output. But I like to work with stereo sounds a lot, and I found a way using the modular how I can create stereo sounds at the source of the synthesis, which means I'm not putting delay on the output or chorus on the output to make it stereo. I make the sound stereo as a part of the synthesis, which is something that's really, really powerful and really nice. And for that, we have to take the output of the filter and go into a multiple, because we have to split the signal. Splitting the signal means we take one and go to one VCA, which will now be our left channel output. And then we take the other one and go to the right VCA, which now will be the right side of the output, which means we have a stereo signal path in the synthesizer, which of course, unless we do anything special to them, will be still a mono sound when we open up the filters and start playing with the sound, because when we have the same signal on the left and the same signal on the right channel, of course the result is a mono sound. So just to recap this, we have oscillators and noise going to the mixer. Mixer is going to the high pass, low pass. Then we split the sound, go to two VCAs, and those two VCAs go to the output mixer. So this is basically the setup that we're using. The modular can of course be synced to the computer. I have a MIDI interface, or several actually, but this one is the clock interface, which goes to a sequencer here, which I can use to select different 16th note patterns or stuff like that. The output of this one then gets distributed over here to get a trigger for the envelopes, and also we can see that this sequencer is already moving. We could use this sequencer now it's called a sequential controller, sequential voltage source, which means we could use now the pots in the top row, for instance, to control the oscillators and create a melody, and use the second row to get some different cutoff positions for every step. Right now, this is not really doing anything, because we just go with the simple 16th note pattern that we get from the MIDI clock and the trigger sequencer. So if we now open up the filter, we should hear sound.